An Apache woman was beaten and left on the road until a cowboy found and brought her home. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Her name was Iona, and the road had no mercy that evening, only wind dragging dust across the hard ground and the slow fade of daylight stretching the shadows long and thin like fingers reaching for what was left behind. She lay where the ruts met the grass, not asking the road for help, not calling out, just breathing and listening to the quiet that follows when the world decides to keep moving without you. The sky was the color of old copper, the kind that comes just before night takes over, and the land around her felt endless, measured in miles that no one intended to walk for her sake. Iona had learned early that silence could be safer than pleading, that stillness could keep you unseen, and so she stayed still, eyes open, counting the sound of her own breath and the distant creak of a fence post somewhere down the way. She did not think of blame, or names or reasons. Those belonged to places with walls and witnesses, not to roads that carried everyone and claimed no one. The marks on her clothing told a story she did not intend to tell, and she kept her hands folded, palms warm against each other, holding on to dignity the way a traveler holds on to water, carefully, sparingly, knowing it might be all that gets them through the night. Time moved in inches, measured by the shift of light and the cooling air, by the smell of sage and dry earth, by the promise that darkness brings cover even as it brings danger. Then there was a sound that did not belong to the wind, a steady rhythm, familiar to the land, closer with every second, hooves striking packed dirt at an easy pace, not hurried, not hunting. The horse appeared first. A dark shape against the fading sky, and then the rider, a man alone, hat low, posture quiet, as if he had learned the value of not announcing himself to the open country. Elias Boone had ridden this road more times than he could count, measuring distance in hours and creeks and the angle of the sun, a cowboy who kept his life small on purpose, who knew that trouble often traveled faster than kindness. He noticed what the road had chosen to leave behind because he was the kind of man who noticed what others passed by, not out of heroics, but out of habit, the habit of paying attention when something did not fit the way it should. He slowed the horse, then stopped, boots touching ground with care, hands open, voice kept low, not asking questions that demanded answers, not making promises he did not yet know how to keep. Iona looked at him then, really looked, not as a symbol or a threat, but as a man standing in the last light, offering water before words, space before touch, patience before judgment. The road did not speak, the land did not intervene, and there was no audience to mark the moment. Only two people sharing the same stretch of dust and the quiet decision that would change where the night led. Because sometimes the beginning of justice sounds like nothing at all, just a horse standing still and a man choosing not to ride on. The cabin sat a little off the road, far enough that wagons rarely bothered to turn, close enough that Elias Boone could still hear the wind change before a storm rolled in. It was a place chosen for quiet, built with hands that preferred work to company. A single room measured in feet and intention, with a porch that faced west and caught the last honest light of the day. Elias led the horse slow, mindful of the way the ground sloped, and the way Iona held herself, steady but careful, as if balance were a promise she did not want to break. He did not speak much, because words could crowd a moment like this, and he had learned that people who had been left behind needed space more than questions. The horse knew the way, stepping easy, hooves dull against dirt, the smell of leather and hay settling into the evening air. When they reached the porch, Elias dismounted first and tied the reins with a practiced knot, one that held without biting, then stepped back and offered his arm without insisting, a simple option left open. Inside, the cabin held the plain comfort of use, a table worn smooth by years of meals taken alone, a kettle resting near the stove, a folded blanket clean and thick enough to matter. Elias moved like someone who had lived alone long enough to arrange his thoughts through motion, setting water to warm, opening a window just enough to let air through, placing the blanket within reach. He kept his back turned while he worked, not out of fear, but respect, the kind that says you are safe to breathe without being watched. Ayana took in the room quietly, noting the small things that told her who he was: boots lying neat by the door, a map pinned straight, a cup chipped but clean, signs of a man who took care without fuss. She did not thank him yet, because gratitude can feel like a debt, and she was not ready to owe anything. Elias understood that too. He placed a cup of water on the table and stepped away, resting his hands on the back of a chair, eyes lowered, letting the silence do the talking. Outside, the light fell away mile by mile, the land settling into its night voice, crickets starting up, a distant owl testing the dark. Elias thought about the road he had ridden for years, the faces that turned away, the way trouble often wore familiar shapes, and how choosing quiet had been his answer. He had left towns behind not because he hated people, but because he trusted himself more when no one was watching. Now, with someone else in the room, he felt the weight of that choice, not as regret, but as awareness. Ayana set the cup down after a careful sip, her hands steady again, her gaze lifting to meet his for the first time since the road. There was no challenge there, no plea, only a simple acknowledgement that two lives had crossed for a reason that did not need naming. Elias nodded once, the smallest signal that said you can stay, you can rest, the night will pass. He took the chair opposite and sat, leaving space between them. Measured in feet and trust, knowing that whatever came next would come in its own time, because sometimes safety is not a promise spoken aloud, but a place where nothing is demanded and nothing is taken. Morning came soft and gray, the kind that slips in without asking, laying light across the floorboards and the table where the cups still sat. Elias Boone woke before the sun cleared the low ridge, a habit built from years of cattle checks and weather watching, and he stayed still for a moment, listening. The cabin held its quiet, steady and calm, the small sounds of settling wood and breath moving in the other part of the room. He rose without hurry, boots in hand, and stepped outside to let the cool air clear his head. The land stretched out the same as always, open and honest, measured in fence lines in the long view, but something in him had shifted, subtle as the turn of a creek after rain. He brewed coffee and set it to warm, keeping the routine because routine had a way of making choices clearer. When he turned back, Ayana was awake, seated near the table, posture composed, eyes tracing the map on the wall as if reading more than lines. He nodded once in greeting, not breaking the calm, and poured coffee into 2 cups, setting one near her without comment. She accepted it with a quiet look that said she understood the rules of this place, that nothing here would be forced. Outside, the horse shifted and snorted, and the day announced itself with birds and the far-off call of cattle. Elias took a sip and weighed what came next, because helping once was one thing, but choosing again meant the road would not simply take care of itself. He knew the nearest town was 12 miles east, a place with a store and a post office and a memory for faces, and he knew how stories traveled there, how quickly kindness could be twisted into suspicion. He also knew the land south of his cabin opened into long stretches where a person could move unseen, following dry washes and the low ground, if that was what they needed. Ayana met his eyes then, steady and clear, not asking to be hidden, not asking to be taken anywhere, just waiting to see what kind of man he would be when the day required a decision. Elias set his cup down and spoke at last, voice level, words chosen for their weight. He said she could stay until the light was strong and her steps sure, that there was water and food and a place to rest without cost. He said he could ride with her part of the way if she wished, or point her toward a safer path if she preferred to go alone. He did not ask where she came from or where she planned to end, because answers earned under pressure rarely told the truth. Ayana listened, hands folded, and when she replied her voice was quiet, the cadence of someone used to choosing carefully. She said she would walk when the sun was higher, that moving by daylight mattered, and that she did not need escort, only a direction that kept her off the main road. Elias nodded again and took the map from the wall, tapping a route that followed the land rather than the lines drawn on paper, miles measured by creeks and stands of cottonwood. He packed bread and dried meat, filled a canteen, and set them on the table, stepping back to give her space to decide. Outside, the wind picked up just enough to move the grass, a reminder that nothing stays still for long. Elias felt the pull of the old choice, the one that said ride on and let the world sort itself out, and he felt the new one settle in its place, quieter but firmer. He would not chase trouble, but he would not send it away either. When Iona stood ready, he opened the door and held it without ceremony, the morning light spilling in. Whatever followed would follow, but for now, the choice had been made, and it sounded like nothing more than a door opening and a man staying put. They did not take the road, not the straight one that carried wagons and gossip alike, but a thinner path that bent with the land and kept its own counsel. Elias walked a few steps ahead, setting a pace that asked nothing and allowed everything, while Iona followed with the quiet assurance of someone who knew how to read ground and sky. The morning warmed by degrees, measured in the length of shadows and the way the air loosened around the shoulders, and the land opened into low hills stitched with grass and stone. Elias pointed once to a stand of cottonwood near a dry wash, a marker more useful than any signpost, then kept moving, trusting that she would decide when to speak. It happened near a split in the trail where the earth hardened and the wind carried sound farther than it should, the murmur of voices from a distance, the clink of metal against wood, ordinary noises that felt heavier in the open. Iona slowed, eyes lifting, posture changing just enough to be noticed. Elias felt it then, the tension that comes when the world remembers you exist. He raised a hand, palm open, not to stop her but to steady the moment, and angled them off toward a shallow draw where the grass grew taller. They waited there, not hiding so much as choosing not to announce themselves, listening as the sounds drifted past and thinned. When the voices faded, Elias exhaled and turned, expecting relief, but found caution instead, a careful distance in Iona's eyes that had not been there before. She studied him as if weighing a story against the evidence of the land, and he understood the question she did not ask. Why help if trouble followed? Why choose a path that narrowed? He answered without defending himself, words plain and slow, saying the land taught him to step aside when needed and to stand when it mattered, that not every meeting required explanation. Iona nodded once, accepting the shape of that answer without surrendering her guard, and they moved again, the draw guiding them until it widened and spilled them into light. It was there that misunderstanding took root, not from malice but from the way distance reshapes truth. A rider appeared on the far rise, hat tipped forward, posture casual, the kind of man who believed the land belonged to whoever crossed it first. He slowed when he saw them, not stopping, not passing, just watching, and Elias felt the old calculation surface, the measure of space and time, the cost of being noticed. He lifted a hand in greeting, neutral and brief, and the rider answered in kind, eyes flicking from Elias to Iona and back again, curiosity sharpened by difference. The man asked a question that sounded harmless enough, where they were headed, the kind people asked to fill the air, but Elias heard the weight beneath it, and chose his words carefully, saying they were bound for water and shade, nothing more. Iona said nothing, keeping her gaze level, refusing the invitation to explain herself. The rider lingered a second longer than necessary, then nodded and moved on, the sound of hooves receding until the land took it back. When it was quiet again, Elias felt the space between them tighten, not with fear but with the knowledge that being seen changes what comes next. Iona spoke then, voice even, saying that questions had a way of following answers, and Elias agreed, adding that the safest truths were often the smallest ones. They walked in silence after that, the path narrowing, the day advancing, each step a negotiation between caution and trust. By the time the sun climbed high enough to bleach the color from the grass, they reached the place where the draw ended and the land divided, one way leading toward the long view and another slipping south into cover. Elias stopped there, not because he had to, but because stopping marked the choice. He pointed to the southern line, explaining how it would keep her off the main crossings for a few miles, how the land would fold around her and let her pass. Iona considered the line, then him, and for the first time allowed a trace of relief to soften her expression. Not gratitude, not yet, but recognition that misunderstanding could be met with patience instead of retreat. Elias stepped back to give her the space to take the path, understanding that tension does not resolve itself with promises, only with time and the steady proof of restraint. They did not separate at the divide, not yet, because the land has a way of asking one more question after you think you have answered it. A band of clouds rose from the west, thin at first, and then gathering weight, and the wind shifted to carry a cooler edge that spoke of change. Elias watched the sky and felt the familiar calculation settle in, miles and minutes lining up in his head, and he said quietly that the weather would thicken before noon, that the draw would hold shade but not shelter. Iona considered the clouds, then the ground beneath her feet, and nodded, the decision forming without ceremony. They turned together, angling back toward the cabin, not as retreat but as a practical choice, the kind that keeps people moving forward by stepping sideways. The path back felt shorter, measured now in shared purpose rather than distance, and they walked with an easy rhythm that did not require words. Elias pointed out landmarks as they went. A limestone outcrop shaped like a broken wheel, a line of mesquite that marked a shallow spring after rain, details offered freely and received without obligation. Iona listened, storing the map in her own way, reading the country as much as his directions. When the wind picked up, she adjusted her shawl and Elias slowed, matching her pace, a small courtesy that carried weight. By the time the cabin came into view, the clouds had drawn close enough to dim the sun, the air thickening with the promise of rain that might come hard or not at all. Elias opened the door and set about the simple tasks that turn a place into a pause, setting water to boil, laying out dry wood, making room without rearranging a life. Iona took a seat near the window and watched the sky change color, the land darkening in patches as shadows slid across it. The first drops arrived soft and scattered, tapping the roof like fingers counting time, and the smell of wet earth drifted in, familiar and grounding. They ate quietly, bread and beans warmed and shared without comment, the kind of meal that asks nothing more than attention. As the rain steadied, Elias spoke of the southern line again, tracing it on the table with a fingertip, explaining where the ground rose and fell, where water would collect and where it would not. He said the storm would pass by afternoon, that the land would breathe and open again. Iona listened and then added her own markers, a ridge that caught light late, a bend in the wash where tracks disappeared, knowledge meeting knowledge without contest. When the rain eased and the light returned, she stood and checked her pack, movements sure, strength returning in small, honest measures. Elias filled the canteen and handed it to her, meeting her eyes this time, not to bind the moment but to mark it. She took it and, after a pause, spoke his name, testing the sound, anchoring the exchange in something human. He answered with hers, careful with the syllables, and the space between them settled into respect. At the door, the wind calmed and the sky lifted, the land rinsed and clear. Elias stepped aside and held the door, the same simple gesture as before, and Iona crossed the threshold, not as someone leaving refuge but as someone choosing a direction. Outside, the ground steamed faintly, the world reset in small ways. Elias walked with her a short distance, enough to see the line she would take, enough to be certain, then stopped and let the land take over. There were no promises exchanged, no assurances beyond the map they shared and the understanding that the road does not own a person who knows where they are going. As Iona moved south and the grass closed behind her, Elias turned back toward the cabin, the rain-washed boards waiting, the day still open, and felt the quiet satisfaction of having brought someone home long enough for them to leave on their own terms. The afternoon stretched thin after she left, the kind of time that looks empty until it fills with meaning, and Elias Boone found himself circling the cabin without purpose, noticing things he had learned to ignore. The rain had rinsed the dust from the porch, leaving pale arcs where boots had passed, and the kettle cooled on the stove with a small ticking sound that counted seconds. He set his tools in order, stacked wood, checked the fence line, and still the thought returned, not as a worry but as a pattern beginning to show itself. He replayed the morning in pieces, the way Iona had chosen her words, the way she had avoided the main crossings, the careful distance she kept when voices carried, and he understood that caution like a language spoken fluently. Toward evening he saddled the horse and rode east a short way, not to chase her trail but to see the edges of the world he knew, the places where lines blurred. Near the shallow bend where the land met the road, he noticed small signs that did not belong to weather or chance, a scarf snagged on brush, a cup cracked and set aside, things abandoned in a hurry by people who expected not to return. He did not touch them. He did not need to. The land told enough of the story without being asked. When he reached the outskirts of town, he did not go in, not past the last fence and the leaning sign, but he listened from a distance, the way a man listens when he wants the truth and knows it will not be offered directly. Voices drifted on the evening air, ordinary talk about prices and routes and who had passed through, and beneath it ran a current that tightened his jaw, words that flattened people into categories and reduced stories to rumors. He turned back before anyone noticed him, the horse taking the road home with easy certainty. By the time the cabin came into view, the light had softened again, the sky clearing as if nothing had happened. Inside, Elias sat at the table and laid out what he knew, not as facts but as connections, the way a trail reveals itself when you stop trying to force it. He thought of how Ayanna had accepted water without thanks, how she had studied the map as if measuring not miles but intentions, how she had spoken his name once, and then let it rest. He understood then that what had found her on the road was not an accident of place or time but a consequence of being visible where others preferred shadows. The cruelty was not loud, not dramatic, but practiced, a habit reinforced by silence and the comfort of numbers, and it traveled easily because no one named it. Elias felt the weight of that knowledge settle, not as anger but as resolve, the kind that narrows choices and makes them clear. He did not reach for a rifle or plan a confrontation. He cleaned the table, folded the blanket, and set a lantern by the door where it could be seen from a distance, a simple signal that the place was awake and watched. He slept lightly and woke before dawn, listening to the wind shift again, listening for the absence of sound that means something has changed. When the sun rose, he rode south to the first ridge and stopped, scanning the draw where Ayanna would have passed, satisfied by the lack of disturbance. He rode back and opened the cabin to the day, leaving the door unlatched, a quiet statement that this ground would not cooperate with fear. As the hours moved, a rider passed on the far rise and slowed, curiosity tugging, then continued on. Without stopping. Another followed later and did the same. Elias watched from the shade and understood that justice does not always arrive as a verdict or a crowd, sometimes it arrives as uncertainty, as the moment when people realize their habits will not be indulged here. He brewed coffee and waited, knowing that the land keeps its own time and that truth, once seen, has a way of moving outward without being pushed. By the third day the quiet had changed its shape, no longer empty but attentive, the kind that listens back. Elias Boone felt it in the way the horse lifted its head when distant riders crested a ridge, and then turned away, in the way the wind carried pauses between sounds, as if the land itself were holding a breath. He went about his work openly, mending a rail, stacking feed, keeping the lantern trimmed and visible even in daylight, a signal not of challenge but of presence. Word moved faster than people, and it arrived in fragments. A glance held a moment too long from a passing rider, a question asked and withdrawn before it finished forming. Elias answered only what was asked and nothing more, his voice even, his posture unhurried, letting the weight of certainty do the work that arguments never could. South of the cabin, Ayanna moved as the land allowed, choosing cover without hiding, walking when the sun flattened shadows and resting when the air grew thin. She felt the shift as well, the subtle change that comes when eyes begin to follow without finding, when the main crossings grow uneasy and the side paths grow welcoming. She paused at a low ridge and looked back once, not to mark a bound but to measure a line of safety that now extended farther than it had days before. In town, small certainties began to fray. Stories did not align the way they used to, and questions returned unanswered, circling without landing. A man who had prided himself on knowing every road found that his knowledge did not travel with him, that some doors closed politely, and some conversations ended early. No one accused. No one threatened. The difference lay in what people chose not to do. Elias received a visitor near midday, a neighbor from miles off who stopped at the fence and did not dismount, hands resting easy on the saddle. Horn. The man spoke of weather and cattle and the price of grain, then hesitated, eyes sliding to the open door of the cabin and the lantern set just inside. He said he had heard things and then laughed it away, an apology folded into the sound. Elias listened and nodded, offering water, keeping his ground. When the neighbor left, he did so slower than he had arrived, carrying the sense that some lines, once crossed, could not be recrossed without cost. As afternoon wore on, a small procession passed the far rise, riders spaced out, not together, each making the same calculation and reaching the same conclusion. They did not stop. They did not wave. They let the land decide. Elias understood then that escalation does not always gather people into a crowd, sometimes it disperses them, turning confidence into caution. He set a stool on the porch and sat where he could be seen, hat tipped back, eyes on the horizon, the picture of a man with nothing to hide and nothing to prove. The sun moved west and the air steadied, and with it came the quiet justice of exposure, the realization spreading that whatever had been done could not be undone, and would not be repeated here. Iona reached the edge of a cottonwood stand by late afternoon, and filled her canteen, listening to the water and the birds, the ordinary sounds of a place not bent by fear. She took a longer rest than she had planned, trusting the moment, trusting the map that had been shared without strings. As evening approached, she resumed her path, confident that the land had turned a page without announcing it. Back at the cabin, Elias lit the lantern as the light fell, not because it was needed, but because it had become part of the language spoken here. The road remained open, the door unlatched, and the world adjusted around that simple fact, learning that justice, when it comes quietly, has a way of staying. The morning arrived with a clarity that felt earned, light laying itself across the land as if to show what had been there all along. Elias Boone rose and opened the cabin wide, letting the air move through, dust motes lifting and settling like a decision made and released. He saddled the horse but did not mount, choosing instead to work near the road where anyone passing could see him plainly, a man present in his own life. By mid-morning, the first of them appeared at a distance, not a group, not a charge, but a pair of riders easing their pace as they approached the rise, eyes measuring, shoulders set with a confidence that did not quite fit anymore. They stopped short of the fence and waited. Elias met them halfway, stopping where the ground flattened and the wind carried voices cleanly, hands visible, posture easy. The questions they asked were ordinary, wrapped in courtesy, about routes and whether he had seen anyone pass. Elias answered with the same ordinary care, offering water, offering shade, saying what was true, and no more. The men listened and looked past him to the open door, the lantern within, the marks of a place that had chosen light over secrecy. One of them cleared his throat and said there had been talk, the kind that grows legs and runs without direction, and Elias nodded, acknowledging talk for what it was. He said the land around here remembered what people did on it, and that memory did not need help. There was a pause then, long enough to matter, the riders exchanging a look that carried a conclusion they did not voice. They thanked him for the water they did not drink and turned away, the decision made without spectacle. The quiet did not rush back, it settled carefully, as if testing its footing. Later, another rider came alone and did not dismount, hat brim low, words chosen and then left unsaid. He asked nothing and received nothing, and when he rode on, he did so with his shoulders a little less sure. By afternoon, the road had learned its lesson, traffic thinning not because of fear but because certainty had shifted elsewhere. Elias returned to the porch and sat, the stool steady beneath him, watching the heat ripple above the ground. Far to the south, beyond the folds of land and water, Iona reached a high place where the world opened and held. She stopped there and took in the long view, the way the land stitched itself together with patience, the way paths could be chosen without being watched. She rested and moved on, confident now that the question behind her had been answered without her presence required. Back at the cabin, the day wore on and brought a small procession of ordinary life, a neighbor waving from the road, a wagon passing without slowing, the sound of birds returning to the cottonwood. Elias brewed coffee and poured one cup, then two, setting the second aside by habit before smiling at himself and setting it back. As evening approached, the light took on its softer edge, the kind that forgives and reveals at the same time. Elias lit the lantern not because the dark demanded it but because the habit had become a promise kept. He stood in the doorway and looked out, knowing that nothing had been settled by decree and everything had been settled by choice. The justice that arrived did not punish and did not proclaim. It simply removed the space where wrong could pretend it belonged. When night came, it came clean, and the road stayed quiet, the kind of quiet that means people have learned where not to linger. Time did what it always does when left alone, it smoothed the edges and kept what mattered. Weeks passed and the land settled into its old rhythms, cattle moving with the light, wind rising and falling, the road carrying only what belonged to it. Elias Boone kept the cabin as he always had, door unlatched by day, lantern ready by night, a place that asked nothing and offered steadiness in return. He found that people spoke to him differently now, not with fear or challenge, but with a careful respect that came from having seen something simple stand firm. No one mentioned names or events. They spoke of weather and work and the long view, and Elias listened, answering when it was useful, letting silence do the rest. South of the cabin, Iona reached a place where the ground rose gently and water ran clear between stones, a place known to her people as a stopping point rather than a destination. She rested there and then moved on again, carrying the map not as paper but as memory, the way the land opens when treated with care. When she joined others, she did not recount the road in detail. She spoke instead of a man who had offered water first, of a place where light was chosen over secrecy, and that was enough. The season turned and with it came small signs of change, a wagon stopping briefly at the fence to ask after a route, a rider tipping his hat without slowing, the road learning to pass without pressing. Elias noticed the absence of trouble more than its presence, the way nothing happened where once something might have. He took that as the measure of things set right. One afternoon, as the sun leaned west, a figure appeared at the far edge of the draw, moving with a confidence that did not hurry. Elias watched without rising, recognizing the shape of a familiar walk before the face came clear. Iona approached and stopped at a respectful distance, the wind between them carrying the smell of grass and water. She looked well, steadier than before, the road having released its hold. Elias stood and met her halfway, neither surprised nor expectant, simply present. They spoke briefly, words chosen for clarity rather than weight. She said she was passing through and wished to see the place again, to mark it properly in her memory. He nodded and opened the door, the same gesture as before, no more and no less. They shared water and a quiet moment, standing where the light fell cleanly across the floor. There was no accounting demanded, no debt named. When she left, it was with a small token pressed into his hand, a smooth stone from the creek where paths cross and separate, not as a charm but as a reminder. Elias watched her go until the land took her back, then returned to his work, the stone finding a place on the shelf by the map. Evening came and he lit the lantern, the habit now part of the place itself. The road lay quiet, not because it was empty, but because it had learned something. Elias stood on the porch and looked out, understanding that justice does not always announce itself with noise or numbers. Sometimes it arrives as a man choosing not to look away, a woman choosing her own direction, and a stretch of land that refuses to forget. The night settled gently, the kind that allows breath to slow, and the lantern burned steady, a small light held by a simple choice, enough to keep the darkness honest.